Hi, I'm Maria Judnick, and I'm the editor of The Right Attitude here at the San Jose State University Writing Center. And it's my great pleasure to be interviewing Sally Ashton, a San Jose State lecturer and author who has been at San Jose State since 2008. So, Sally, let's talk a little bit about your new book,
All right.
The Behavior of Clocks. So, in your introduction to your new book, you've discussed how Albert Einstein inspired this collection. Besides Einstein, what other muses have inspired you as you write?
Well, that's an interesting question, and I think whereas in one book I had a donkey as the source of the inspiration, in other cases I thought, really what is intriguing to me are any aspects of mystery, and I think that's why I'm drawn to astrophysics and cosmology, stuff that's going on with discoveries in space, is because it represents in some way a really big mystery that we are just learning about, and yet is so prevalent in our lives. The stars, the moon, how far away they are, how we might travel there one day. So I think that things of mystery are would be, I know that's not really specific as Einstein, but that is, I think, what tends to catch my attention.
All right, great. So, you've taught for many years, as I said, at San Jose State since 2008, but you've also offered a lot of different workshops around the world, some in Portugal, some in California, some sort of nationwide. What's some of the writing advice that you've given to your students, but you don't always take yourself?
Well, I think what comes to mind pretty quickly is that you always say when we teach writing that writers write. And so a writer needs to have some sort of regular practice. And while at different times in my life that's been much more easier to achieve, I find I have to continually remind myself to create the fuel from which I work. So I do keep a journal, and I used to write in it religiously, I guess I'd say, once a day. Then when I had a fairly heavy teaching load or other life events have come up, that practice falls away. And then I go back to the journal, and it's fairly bereft of ideas. So a writer needs to write, a writer needs to write, self to self. Yeah.
Good advice.
Yeah.
So your new collection, The Behavior of Clocks, seems to really seamlessly blend and dance between genre. There's some prose poetry, there's a sense of flash that's really prevalent in the text. Do you often work in multiple genres, and how is your experience editing your work in multiple genres different?
Good question. Actually, this collection was intentionally planned to be a multi-genre short approach to what it approaches, which is time, memory, and a sense of space, so the aspects of Einstein's theory of relativity as we might experience it in our own lives. So I have a flash series where it's a speculative fiction where a person is imagining what it would be like to be on a train with Albert Einstein. Then there are brief pieces from my family history, and then there are what we typically understood or recognize as prose poem. And they very much do have a different loyalty. So I always say that Flash has a loyalty or owes something to the narrative arc. It needs to have something that's happening. Whereas a prose poem can have something that happens. It could be narrative, but its loyalty is more to language and the image, and maybe something that has more to do with the distilled moment. And then, as we know, nonfiction is loyal to what really happened. And so you can't necessarily change, at least the way I approach it, necessarily change details in order to make it sound better or turn out better, but you have to be faithful to things as at least best remembered as they happened.
All right.
So in terms of editing, those are what I look at.
Great. When you were the Santa Clara County Poet Laureate, you did some great work making poetry accessible to the public. What sort of projects would you like to see to help to continue to expose new readers to poetry?
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, because I really had a good time in that role. And what the two projects I did, I adapted from the U.S. Poet Laureates had done, two similar projects, one being poetry on the move or poetry in public transportation, as well as the favorite poem project. I think, and I wish, someone had been able to continue the poetry in public transportation, because it's such a perfect way for people who are just sitting there either looking at their phones, clearly not looking at each other. I've ridden light rail long enough to know that we just don't do that. And so it's kind of a natural way to catch someone's attention with something almost in a haiku form that distills a moment, that gives people something to think about, that maybe lifts them in some way. So it's not something different. I wish that in the public format, other than or besides the performances that are done, which I think are really exciting, but typically for people who are already interested in poetry, I think things that appear, whether it's on light rail or maybe, chalk on a corner or some kind of poster, something that is kind of a person who wouldn't normally look at poetry kind of runs into it and is interested or moved in some way if they are.
Great. All right, my next question is, we recently celebrated our Legacy of Poetry Day here at San Jose State. So first I'd like to hear a little bit about how you see San Jose State as part of a larger conversation around poetry. And then I'd also love to hear what kind of advice you'd offer to new poets, whether here at San Jose State or elsewhere.
Yeah, good. I'm really excited that San Jose State has chosen to celebrate the Legacy of Poetry Day, because I see San Jose State, in terms of the legacy of poetry in Santa Clara County, as being in a very a place of beginning for poetry. I'll put it that way, which is clunky a little. But since the literary arts began to be celebrated in a larger way, San Jose State has always played a pivotal role with poet laureates, Henry Bland, his relationship with Senator Phelan up at Montalvo, and that really was sort of the beginning of creating a more literary scene outside of San Francisco, which is always, in some sense, our competitor. So I see the Legacy of Poetry Day as a way for San Jose State to stay in the conversation and the dialogue around poetry. I think for a while we looked inward around the literary arts and nurturing poets within the university, but our role as a voice for literature and poetry, I think, is an important one to maintain. So whether that's bringing in recognizable poets like we did with Forrest Gander and Arthur Z this year, or just providing a platform and reminding people of San Jose State's legacy, and then creating new legacy opportunities for students and poets of all proficiency. And you already asked me that? Mm-hmm. Okay. Then as far as advice for new poets, there's, clearly I'm a teacher, so there's always what I said at the beginning, writers write, so there's always a poet, or any writer has to read, a poet has to write, and a poet has to revise. But I think one of the overlooked things that all writers need is to develop community. So the director at my MFA program at Bennington, Liam Rector, had a saying that I wrote down. He said, "Find those with whom you have rapport and proceed." It sounded really heady at the time, find those with whom you have rapport and proceed. But I have to say, as a beginning writer, after my graduation and moving forward into having books published and publishing an online journal, those people who I had created and found as a sense of community, who were like-minded, have continued to play a pivotal role in my poetry career. I think that students often get overwhelmed. They have so much to finish in terms of schoolwork, everything else going on, that can easily be overlooked. Also, sometimes in the academic setting with creative writing, there perhaps is a sense of competition. And what we need to remind ourselves is that going forward, we go forward in a writing community where others can help give us feedback, can provide us with opportunities. And so that's what I would say. Find those with whom you have rapport and proceed.